Welcome back. Okay, let's just jump right into this. Today's explainer is, honestly, a dramatic tale. We're looking at what is arguably the most dramatic tale of rapid transformation the world has ever seen. We are going to analyze the data behind the most deliberate, state-engineered industrial growth machine in modern history, China. Over the last 4 decades, China didn't just kind of stumble into economic dominance, you know? They built this incredibly complex economic engine literally from scratch. As a political economist, it is absolutely fascinating to see exactly how this machine was designed, what fueled it, and why, after decades of absolute hypergrowth, the data shows it's suddenly starting to crack.
Now you might be wondering, what does that rapid transformation actually look like? Well, take a look at Shenzhen. Back in 1980, this place was a poor rural fishing village. Fast forward to today, it is a $500 billion high-tech metropolis. It's almost unbelievable. This staggering visual contrast is the ultimate microcosm for China's rise. It perfectly shows us what happens when a state-engineered growth model is firing on all cylinders. But to understand how a fishing village becomes a global tech hub in a single generation, we really have to look under the hood.
So here is our diagnostic readout for today's explainer. First, the blueprint. Second, fueling the export machine. Third, the high-tech software upgrade. Fourth, the Belt and Road expansion. And finally, why this engine is cracking.
Let's start with part 1, the blueprint, designing the machine.
What absolutely blew my mind with looking at this foundational architecture is this concept of state-directed capitalism. China basically engineered a totally unique hybrid system. They combined strict communist political control over the land, the banks, and key industries, but then they just threw the doors wide open to fierce capitalist competition in manufacturing and exports. Functionally, this state-led model forced rapid infrastructure scaling. Think about it. In a Western democracy, you might spend 5 years just debating whether to build a new highway. Under this blueprint, Beijing simply points to a map, builds the road, and argues about it later.
But you can't just risk the whole country on an unproven experiment, right? So to test this new engine, they created special economic zones, or SEZs, starting with our earlier example of Shenzhen. These zones featured zero taxes, totally relaxed regulations, and they actively welcomed foreign investment. They essentially created capitalism inside communism, without ever committing to it ideologically. These SEZs served as perfectly calibrated test tracks for industrial expansion. And once the blueprint worked in Shenzhen, they basically copy-pasted it across dozens of coastal cities.
Moving on to part 2, fueling the export machine.
Okay, so with the factory floor built, the engine desperately needed fuel, and China had an unprecedented reservoir ready to be burned, 800 million rural workers. To put that massive number into perspective, that is more than double the entire population of the United States, transitioning from agriculture to coastal factories almost overnight. This historic demographic dividend provided the cheapest industrial workforce on Earth. When you compare China's manufacturing dominance to the industrial output of emerging global economies at that time, there was literally no competition. No one else had 800 million highly disciplined workers willing to work for a fraction of Western wages. That single input turned China into the factory of the world.
But here's the thing, cheap labor wasn't the only fuel. The state actively rigged the gauges. By deliberately keeping the yuan undervalued against the US dollar, they engaged in currency manipulation. Now, objectively speaking, this functioned as a mechanical lever to create an undeniable and somewhat unfair global price advantage. For over 20 years, the rest of the world was essentially buying Chinese goods well below their real cost. It was a massive turbo boost to their export engine that no free market economy could mathematically compete with.
And this brilliantly illustrates the real genius of the machine, the export loop. It works like this. Manufacture cheaply, export aggressively, accumulate foreign dollars, and then reinvest by buying U.S. Treasury bonds. By recycling foreign currency reserves into U.S. bonds, China functionally funded American consumers, so we could just keep buying more of their cheap goods. It was a perfect closed-circuit loop that sustained their export growth cycles year after year. Which brings us to part 3, the high-tech software upgrade.
So, an engine built only on cheap labor is eventually going to hit a ceiling. The state realized they had to shift the model from basic assembly-based manufacturing to original, high-tech product design and development. To pull this off, they heavily subsidized technical education, pumping out over 1 million STEM graduates every single year. This massive influx of engineering brainpower completely shifted the focus. By 2015, they weren't just relying on cheap labor dependency anymore, they actually had the talent to drive frontier-level technological innovation. However, building true innovation from scratch takes decades, so they accelerated the process through forced technology transfer. If a foreign company wanted access to China's massive consumer market, they were legally required to partner with a domestic firm and share their patents. Now, Western democracies naturally viewed this as blatant intellectual property theft, while China viewed it simply as the toll for market access. But regardless of where you stand on it, functionally, it drastically accelerated domestic innovation. This directly led to the rise of global dominators like Huawei and DJI.
All right, Part 4, Belt and Road Expansion. As China's domestic growth began to mature, this massive industrial machine needed a global transmission system to keep expanding. Enter the Belt and Road Initiative. China poured over $1 trillion into developing nations across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. They built roads, railways, and ports in exchange for direct access to raw resources. This not only created new export markets for Chinese goods, but it secured immense strategic and political influence globally. It physically locks in global supply chains, though it definitely introduces a severe risk of debt dependency for the developing nations taking on those loans.
To see how this abstract geopolitical strategy translates to physical reality, let's look at the Djibouti port in the Horn of Africa. This is a majority Chinese-funded piece of critical infrastructure that establishes a critical node controlling the gateway to the Red Sea and the Somali coastal trade routes. It's a perfect example of how the Belt and Road project isn't just about building roads. It's about physically anchoring global trade to Chinese influence.
And finally, Part 5, Why the Engine is Cracking.
Let's slow down here for a second, because this is where the data takes a dramatic turn. After 40 years of defying economic gravity, this state-directed machine is overheating, and it's hitting massive structural walls. Let this number sink in. 21%. That was China's youth unemployment rate in 2023. Think about that. You have a massive, highly educated generation of STEM graduates entering a slowing economy, and they literally can't find work. This acts as an immediate threat to future social and political stability. An industrial engine just cannot run smoothly if a fifth of its newest gears are sitting idle. And that brings us to, honestly, the most unfixable crack in the foundation. We talked earlier about that historic demographic dividend of 800 million young workers fueling rapid expansion. Well, the modern demographic reality is grim. Birth rates have crashed. The workforce is rapidly shrinking, while an aging population is absolutely skyrocketing pension costs. The very human fuel that built this manufacturing dominance is running dry, completely threatening future growth stability.
Add to that these massive structural engine failures. You have the spectacular collapse of developers like Evergrande, representing a broader property sector crisis. Because real estate makes up nearly 30% of China's GDP, the long-term impact of this massive internal infrastructure investment is actually devastating to their total economic efficiency, deeply undermining state investments. Then there's the middle-income trap. Rising domestic wages mean China is simply no longer the cheapest option. Externally, current United States decoupling efforts, featuring tech sanctions and tariffs, are actively shifting the global power balance. The machine is buckling under internal debt and external hostility.
So, what does this all mean? It leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. China grew faster than any nation in history because the state had total, uncompromising control over capital, labor, and infrastructure. But now, those very same levers have created immense demographic deficits and debt crises. Can a state-engineered machine of this size dynamically fix its own structural cracks? Or are we witnessing the definitive end of the era of hypergrowth? It's a huge question, one that's going to determine the future balance of global power. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll see you in the next one.